Today, we're joined by Durrant from Hemp Lime Spray, one of the leading experts in hempcrete buildings. Now, you've been doing this for about 13 years, give or take, and you got into it in France.
I came across Hempcrete in France first of all, and then we moved back to the UK. I did a master's in environmental architecture, and then I decided that I wanted to champion hempcrete. It seemed like a really good material theoretically and academically, and then having worked with it for the last 13 years, I realised just how good it is.
So why is it so good? Why do we use it?
Well, why? It's low carbon, it's an insulation with thermal mass, and it's breathable. And all of those things combine to make it a really comfortable environment. If you can manage moisture and you manage temperature well, you end up with comfort. And if it's locking up carbon and it's not full of toxic materials, then actually you've got a brilliant building material.
So at the minute we're in the Derby Dales. We've been working on solid stone building and brick building.
Yeah.
Late 17th, early 18th
So
century.
this one's a 17th century stone building, and the one we just finished last week was 16th century brick building.
And the hempcrete on there, obviously, everyone's seen it on new builds if they've watched any of our earlier videos. But spraying straight onto stone or brick, is there any benefits to that over conventional materials?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of benefits on solid wall buildings, particularly old ones. You've got to be very careful how you manage moisture, and so you need a material that's going to allow moisture to pass through rather than be trapped. And so the hempcrete enables the building to continue to breathe. You're not actually limiting it in any way, but you're making it more suitable for our modern lifestyles where we don't want to live in cold buildings. The average temperature in 1950 was about 14 degrees in the winter. And we don't want to live in houses that are 14 degrees, so we need to insulate them because otherwise we'll use way too much energy to heat them. And so not only is the hempcrete locking up carbon because it's a carbon negative material, but it's actually making the buildings way more efficient in energy terms.
So with that, normally when people go for something high end or high quality, it could be quite expensive. So how does that compare in material costs to more conventional materials?
In a way, it's a difficult question to answer because I do hempcrete, but I'm not constantly costing for other materials. But I think what I would say is that probably I get 80% of the work that I price for. I get 80% of the work. So I'm not competing with other hempcreters, but I am competing with other materials. And if my costs were ridiculous, then I wouldn't get 80% of the work that I put in for. And I guess what I'd say is you can probably, from a new build point of view, you can probably build a new build cheaper with not such good materials, materials that would either be bad for the planet, materials that wouldn't perform very well. So you can build a crap building for less. But as soon as you're trying to look at building a building with any quality, hempcrete is an obvious, effective choice.
Yeah. Okay, and there's two main methods of hempcreting. There's hand cast and spray, and obviously we both spray, but we also both hand cast.
Yeah.
So is there much of a difference in price when it comes down to that, or is there much of a difference in effort, manual labour in there?
Yeah, so it's funny, people are always saying that hempcreting, hand casting with hempcrete is labour intensive, and I'm not sure that it's any more labour intensive than any other form of building, but it's harder work. It really is hard work, and we notice
taking the buckets up three flights of stairs like we were the other month.
We notice the difference on the days we're spraying or hand casting. So I mean, spraying's not easy, but it's not as hard on the body as the hand casting. So I think what you'd say is, if you think we go onto a new build and there'll be 3 or 4 of us,
Yeah.
and we'll put all that wall into a new build for a sort of a standard 4-bedroom house, and we'll do that all in about 4 weeks. So okay, somebody came along beforehand and built the frame, but we're putting the wall in.
Yeah, all the
And
insulation, the
that's
actual wall as well.
four men in 4 weeks. Well, that to me, if you actually look at the multi-layered systems that architects often choose, I think there's a lot more than 4 weeks and 4 men going into those walls. So I'm not sure it's more labour intensive. And so what I'd say is, if you compare spraying to hand casting, if we set up 2 buildings next to each other and we hand cast one and sprayed the other, what we'd find is both teams would be on site for about 4 weeks, but there'd be 4 of us spraying for 4 weeks. If you were hand casting it to keep up the same pace, you'd probably have 6 or 7 people hand casting. And the first 2 lifts of Hempcrete up to about waist height, there wouldn't be very much at all in the time difference between us spraying it and them hand casting it. But as soon as you get above shoulder height, you really start to notice a difference in how much you're getting into the building. Because as soon as you're starting to lift stuff up, and by the time you're getting up to gable ends, that's where you really see. Yeah. So the spraying is way more efficient and therefore cost effective. And I think it would be fair to say, that hand casting a building is a brilliant way to build, but it is hard work and it would be a little bit more expensive than spraying the building. And I guess you'd have to also say that's just new build. The renovation market, there's no question at all. Spraying Hempcrete in the renovation market is definitely the way forward. We can spray, as you know, we can spray a wall 4 inches thick. Yeah. We can spray a wall in a couple of hours that would take 2 men a day to put in if they were hand casting. It's always difficult when you get up to height. It's difficult to get in under the ceiling. So the sprayer, it's a no-brainer that the sprayer is more cost-effective in that particular situation.
And with that, obviously, we've been working on these buildings the last few weeks. We're only doing around 120 to 130 mil on the inside. Yeah. Is there a minimum you'd go, and is there a maximum?
Yeah, there kind of is. So I won't spray less than 100 millimeters, 4 inches, and that's my personal choice. That's not because you can't.
That gives you.
Well, what I'd say is this: mostly we're spraying on the inside of these old buildings, and in the UK particularly, we don't have. In fact, we have the smallest building stock in Europe, so people don't want to lose an enormous part of their room. So your average house, if you do 4 inches, you'll get a really good thermal upgrade, but you won't lose too much space. If you're doing a barn conversion, you'd probably go to 6 inches or even 8 inches because barns are generally wider and they've got the room for it. And I don't spray under 4 inches generally. I mean, we might narrow it off where there's a stairway or something that that's really limiting the space to move around. But I don't spray thinner than that because you can have it that it dries out before the lime cures. So there's a higher risk factor of there being a problem. It's not happened, but it's a theoretical risk factor. And also it's about value for money. Hempcrete is a brilliant material, but it's not magic. An inch of Hempcrete is not going to change your life. 4 inches of Hempcrete can make you really comfortable in an old stone building or a brick building. But an inch of it, in terms of value for money, it's a similar amount of work when you're spraying it. So I wouldn't spray just an inch. I would just not take the job.
But you might also say there's a maximum that you wouldn't go to if spraying onto a
stone building. So you've got to be careful. If you insulate an old period property or a solid wall property, you don't want to go too thick with insulation because you can end up with a situation where the insulation, its main job is to stop heat going out of the building. And what can happen is if you have an old brick wall or stone wall on the outside and you've put loads of insulation, I'm talking a foot of insulation or more, on the inside. What you're doing, you're starving the outer wall of heat, but because it's a breathable material, you've still got moisture going out through that wall. So it's heat energy that dissipates moisture. So on the north side of a building, for example, it's not quite the same on the south side in the northern hemisphere. But on the north side of a building, if you've got moisture going into the outer wall, no sunshine on the outer wall, and no heat to dissipate the moisture that's going through to the outside wall, you can end up with a lot of moisture in your north wall. And then when it gets really cold, that moisture can freeze and thaw, and then it will damage the fabric of the building, the original building.
Right.
So you don't want to over insulate. And I've actually recently had a few times where building inspectors have specified on these old buildings that they want to meet a U value of 0.18, which is a ridiculously low target. They're trying to turn these buildings into new builds, and it's a crazy move because we're going to seriously damage our building stock if we over insulate them. With any, even a breathable material, you can over insulate.
Yeah. And so when it comes to those old buildings, and we're only doing, around 100 mil, 120 mil, something like that, so it's always a bit too thin to hand cast, to place.
Yeah.
Now, there has been a lot of questions on some of Matt's other videos about the shutters we use. They're actually your shutters. So
Yeah.
how did you come by those? And why do we use those on some jobs, but on jobs like the last video on Callum's where we were spraying, we were shuttering with OSB?
Okay. Right. So, well, there's a lot to unwrap there. So
It's a big one for you.
I've got to remember all the questions. That's going to be the difficult thing. So essentially, I use that shuttering system because it's the one I inherited from my days when I worked for the Hempcrete company, and they really are very, very good. Those shutters make shuttering so much easier. They're really expensive to buy. That's the big drawback to that shuttering system. And for a DIY kind of one-off build, it's just not worth buying them. There's ways of making, if anybody's interested, I can show them how. There's ways of making shuttering that's not quite as good.
I'm sure someone
but
will be interested in that.
It will get through the job. So we use them because as contractors, it's just the most quick and effective way of doing it. We use, if we're doing a new build and the frame is on the outside, we would tend to use OSB because it's quicker to slide around the outside of the building. And when we were looking at Callum's building, the reason we used 6mm ply on the inside because it had to bend around all the old timbers.
Yeah.
So using that flexible shuttering worked better. So you're going to have to remind me what some of the other bits of the question were.
No, I think you've pretty much got it.
So the black shuttering system, if you're in the UK, you do have access to it because I can hire it to you.
And that's through your website.
Yeah,
There'll be
description and it's certainly. I mean, everybody that's hired it has said, afterwards they're so glad they did because it makes the job so much easier.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, and with that, what are the pros and cons of the way we do the shuttering, where we move it up and down, as opposed to a permanent shuttering system like a wood wallboard?
Right, yes.
So just sticking your wood wallboard straight on there.
We used to do, when I first started doing hempcrete, we used to do a lot of buildings where the frame would be often on the inside, in that case, with wood wallboard. And then after a time, I just came to the conclusion that we were better off having a purer lime plaster or clay plaster on the inside, hempcrete wall, lime plaster or cladding on the outside. And I think it transfers moisture better. The fewer layers you have in a wall, the better the moisture transfer. And I think the other thing that really put me off of the permanent shutterings was that it slowed the drying times.
Right.
So if you've got a hempcrete wall that's 360mm thick, it'll dry much quicker if it's exposed to air on both sides. So for me, that's why I tend to do simpler walls without additional shuttering. And also there was a phase that people went through using magnesium oxide board and silicate boards and various boards, and they all seemed to come from China, and they seemed to be very dubious in their breathability. They would, breathability is a thing that since it's become, I guess people have realised that breathability is a desirable trait in a building, and since then lots of people have been claiming breathability in their material. And I think that, I mean, pretty much anything, you could argue that almost anything bar tinfoil is breathable. So it's breathability is a complicated subject, and it's probably too complicated for this particular interview.
We might run out of time.
But essentially, there are different levels of breathability, and if you put a board there that they claim is breathable and it turns out not to be very breathable, you haven't necessarily made yourself a good breathable building.
Might be a bit late by the time you figure it out.
Yeah, and so I feel that just having hempcrete and lime and clay or timber cladding, I feel is a purer, more breathable way to go. But I can see the advantage of permanent shuttering. Certainly makes the hempcrete installation easier because you've already got one wall there, so you're just spraying against it or casting against it. So there are circumstances where you might think, actually, this is the best compromise, but it does slow your drying times, and it arguably reduces your breathability a little.
So with a lot of our customers, they are, they're not so much people with mortgages, they're more the people building or finishing their forever homes.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
should they ever come to selling, is there ever a problem when it comes to people getting mortgages? Is there an issue there?
Interesting. I'm not sure.
Because it's a fairly unknown material, realistically.
It is. I guess the thing is, because the hempcrete, it passed LABC approval when it was first brought to the UK back in 1999. They started the first house in the UK, and it's a well enough established building technique now. But I know that insurers and mortgage companies are always very apprehensive of new stuff.
Yeah.
And because it's such a niche market, there hasn't been all. We've tested it thoroughly in terms of real buildings, but there's a lot more research that could be done that would pacify and sort of make the insurance companies happier. So the mortgage companies, I would say, it does depend on the wall build-up and what the exterior surface is, because that's really all they're concerned about. But I've never heard of anybody having a problem getting a mortgage for it, and I've never heard of anybody struggling to sell the house. And I guess it depends on our worldview and what we think about climate change and carbon and everything else. But my guess would be that if you put a hempcrete house on the market, I would think it would sell very easily, because people do want to do, to live in greener houses, as it were.
More comfortable.
Yeah, and they're certainly, I would argue, they're a lot more comfortable than more conventional buildings.
And so for that, and we've touched a bit on different frames when we were talking about the shuttering, but is there a particular way of setting up a frame? Is there a frame that's better for hempcreting onto? If you went with the mind you wanted a hempcrete building, as a new build, how would you go about? What would you look at in terms of the bones of the building?
So the first question I normally ask the clients is, when you look at your building, what do you see? Are you looking at a building that's got a clad exterior, or are you looking at a building that's lime rendered? So if lime is the finish, then you want the frame in the middle.
Yep.
If clad is the finish, you want your frame on the outside.
That's on the outside of the hempcrete or the middle of the hempcrete.
Yeah. So, and the thing is, the thing with cladding, the reason you want your frame on the outside is because cladding, actually, timber cladding or any kind of cladding is actually relatively heavy. Hempcrete is a non-structural material, so you can't just screw into the hempcrete. You want to be able to get the cladding direct onto the structural frame, because as wind, even, you know, not only the weight of the cladding itself, but as wind runs across a building, it creates suction. And if that cladding is not seriously strongly on there in a high wind, it's going to pull off. So you want your frame on the outside always if you're cladding, frame in the middle if you're rendering. And we virtually never put the frame on the inside because it just creates problems when you're plastering. So it's middle or outside of the hempcrete.
Lovely. So, how would you go about finding work in the UK, hempcrete? And have you noticed much more interest as opposed to when you first started?
Yeah,
Is
that's so. What I'd say is, it's not an easy one to get into as a contractor, just by yourself. It's a really simple. You think you've got lime, water, and hemp, and you mix them together. And when you build a wall, it's actually quite a simple process, really, except I see it done badly all the time. And so there is quite a lot of complication and a lot of knowing what not to do and what to do. So I guess I would say to anybody that wanted to get involved in hempcrete, and if they're pretty much from anywhere, but particularly if they're in the UK, like you did, actually, you got in touch with me.
Well, Annie contacted you.
Got in touch with me, and here we are. So I'd say, you know, I'm happy to share. I'm actually retiring at the end of this year, so I'm very happy for young people that want to get into hempcreting to come along and to show them how to do it and what to do. There's certainly more and more interest in hempcrete now. There's a lot more interest now than when I started 13 years ago. It's a no-brainer that we need to be building bio-based buildings. You know, for years, all of our building materials either were mineral-based and came from the ground, or they were petrochemical-based. And we know the implications of that from an energy point of view. It's a no-brainer that we should be using agricultural wastes where we can to build buildings. So I think certainly it's grown a lot in the last 13 years. It'll continue to grow, and yes, it's a niche market for sure. But we are short of contractors. I think it's not going to be long before the demand is much bigger than the number of contractors.
The demand is rising.
It is, and there really aren't very many contractors in the UK.
No.
It's as simple as that.
Be one less come Christmas.
And there'll be one less come Christmas. Can't wait.
And so we also get asked, and I thought about doing it myself on my own build, but hempcrete roofs, how do you go about it? Is there pros? Is there cons? Must we all do it?
No, I don't think we must all do it at all. So no, I think that hempcrete roofs under the right circumstance are very good. But there are some caveats there. So what I'd say is this. In the UK, we don't suffer a great deal from summer overheating. And a hempcrete roof is probably the best way of keeping your upper floors cool. So
it's from the thermal mass of the hempcrete.
Well, it's a combination of thermal mass and insulation. But what I would say is when you walk into a hempcrete building on a really hot summer's day, it's a bit like, in the UK, it's a bit like walking into a church. You get that cool feeling in the building. So, and it's very good in roofs, because obviously it's normally in buildings, it's the upper floors and the roofs that overheat. So if we lived in the south of France, I would say, where they suffer a lot from summer overheating, I would say, yeah, having a hempcrete roof is a really good idea. But the difficulty of hempcrete roofs are that they are a heavier insulation than most roofing insulations, so that you need more structure and there's more weight to be distributed. And also logistically it's difficult because you're putting a wet insulation into a roof rather than a dry one, and that means you've got to have the roof covered over to stop the rain getting on the hempcrete, otherwise arguably it would never dry out.
Right.
but you've also got to have lots of airflow going over the hempcrete to allow it to dry out.
Okay.
So they're logistically difficult. So I've done a few. The easiest way is to have a scaffold that covers the whole building. Then doing a roof like that, if you've got tin over your scaffold and it never rains on the building while you're building it, then that works. But obviously there's a lot of added cost to that kind of scaffolding. Or the roof is small enough that you can, and you're there to cover it and uncover it. So you uncover it on the dry days and you cover it up on the wet days. But logistically they're difficult, and so putting a wet, heavy insulation material into a building is more difficult and therefore more costly. But it could be worth it if you're trying to protect against summer overheating.
Right.
And arguably, you could say, well, in the UK, if we're future proofing, you could say we're going to experience more hot days. So there's a good argument for doing it. But as a general rule, as it stands in the UK, we normally only have a few days where upstairs is too hot. So I don't think there is that absolutely we should be doing hempcrete roofs. I think that's very much a nice option if you want to go down the additional difficulties of doing it.
Well, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Chat with you way too much.
Well, we do talk a lot, don't we? Yeah.
But if anyone wants to have more of a chat with you, anything in depth or questions about their own builds, they can contact you through your website.
Yeah. Oh,
and
yeah.
you do that.
Yeah.
You have Zoom calls.
Yeah. So I do a lot of consultancy over Zoom. My rates are very reasonable, and actually, I recently spoke to some lovely people in Texas, and there was some boat plans that I wanted that were $50, I think they were. So they bought me boat plans in exchange for my consultancy, which I wanted the boat
There
plans.
you go, a bit of a discount for them,
So
and you got what you wanted.
So anyway, see, I don't always do it for just boat plans, but
unless they're really interesting boats.
yeah, well,
So if you
but
have
anyway,
really interesting boat plans.
So yeah, I do, and what I would say is, I've never ever had a meeting with anybody with the consultancy where I hadn't either saved them literally thousands by stopping them going down a road that wasn't going to work, or I made their lives significantly easier by eliminating the risks. Because the problem with doing something like hempcrete that's not very well known or understood is you don't know what you don't know. So
this is the issue a lot of people come with is how can we work out what is real on the internet?
Yeah.
And
yeah. So what I'd say is it kind of sounds like I'm touting for business, and I don't know if I am, but really what I'm saying is what I've tried to do, and actually there's also the Hempcrete forum. Actually, it's worth mentioning.
Yeah.
So I run a thing called the Hempcrete forum on Facebook, and people can ask questions about hempcrete, and we answer the questions. And the reason we set that up, I set it up originally with Will Stanix, who wrote the hempcrete book, and Will Brain in Australia, who's very good with hempcrete. And we set it up because we wanted good information to get out. And having looked at some of the other forums, and you see some of the rubbish that gets talked, so I think I'm as interested in protecting hempcrete as I am anything else. And if I spend time with clients talking through what they can do and what they can't do, it kind of protects the material, and that's really important to me. So so I guess I'm touting for business and protecting hempcrete all at the same time. Yeah.
Brilliant. Right, well, thank you very much, and we'll see you on the next video.